Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 95 of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I hope you are doing well. In this episode, I want to do a deep dive into yoga and menstruation. And I will be referring to women in this episode, but know that when I am referring to women, I'm referring to anyone who refers to themselves as a woman or are vulva owners. Okay. And this is a topic that I have been passionate about for a while. I just haven't brought it up on the podcast, but it's something I have taught for many years at the studio, and have had conversation with a lot of women, especially a lot of Indian and other South Asian women who are clients of mine at my yoga studio, as well as the dance studio. It's an area of interest, women's health in general, because growing up, I did see my mom struggle with health issues most of her life, and a lot of other people. So I always grew up wanting to do anything and everything I could to work on my health and wellness. And in many ways, her struggle became my strength. So in today's episode, I want to talk about menstruation, especially in India, and how it has deep cultural significance, especially in the southern part of India where I'm from, and the impact of this in terms of yoga and the history of it. And I want to get into questions about how to practice if you're on your period. I mean, it's a question I get so often from only my Indian clientele or my South Asian clients. It's not something the average Western yoga practitioner walks into a studio and asks me about, but a lot of Indian women ask me this question. So while I know I have listeners from all parts of the world for this podcast, this will be very relevant to any South Asian listeners, okay, who have clients who ask them the same questions, okay? So even though you might have not paid much attention to this in Western yoga or even in the fitness world, I'm going to be giving you some history, some context, some cultural elements in it, and then talking about what type of practice we should be doing when you're on your period, what you should be avoiding, and what you can do if you have like a heavy flow. We'll talk about PMS a little bit, between cycles, how to practice, and then just so much more. Okay, I'll talk about menopause and how to address this with your students and all of that in today's episode. So I hope you find this interesting or at least intriguing. And before we get to the conversation itself, we're slowly inching towards our 100th episode mark. We are 5 episodes away. And if you want to show your favorite yoga podcast some love, then please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. I know you hear me say this often, and honestly, I don't like asking for it often, but it's really what helps me and our little team get this, which is just me and my editor, honestly, get this content in front of new listeners. The podcast also costs us money to produce, and I'm doing my best in these past 2 years to keep the show ad-free and sponsor-free. So please take a moment to review the show. It's the only way that we can really put this in front of new listeners and really impact the yoga world in whatever little way we can. It would mean the world to me, and will help us keep doing this for a lot longer. Okay. So thank you for doing it in advance, and I will see you on the other side. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex-Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a 6-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. So before we explore what yoga asanas and what type of practice to do if someone is on their period, let's look at a little bit of history, or in my notes it says her story, but let's look at this. Okay, in India, when you have your first menarche, Okay, that's your first menstrual cycle. It's considered to be somewhat of a milestone in a woman's life. Okay, it's considered to be a transition from being a girl to womanhood. And in many parts of the world, and even in many parts of India too, this can be a very hush hush affair meant to be swept under the rug. But on the other side, there are many parts in India, especially in southern India, where this is celebrated. Okay, it's a really grand celebration. People actually will print invitations, like you print for a wedding invitation. People will print invitations. They'll book a venue. Hundreds of people will be invited. And there are so many rituals that surround this. And depending on which part of southern India you're from, there are different ways of celebrating a girl's first menstrual cycle. Now, I come from a different background. Even though I am from southern part of India, this was really we never did any sort of celebration. I think I was just highly embarrassed and didn't want any attention. Anyway, so in the past, this was a way to tell society that, the girl was now a woman. And over time, this was a way to look for potential suitors. But that is history. Will be a little out of context for me to get into right now, but you can find a lot of material online if you're interested in learning more. Okay. But what I want to focus on here is, at least back in the day, okay, these days when a woman in India was considered to be on her period, they were considered days of rest. Okay, I've heard some yoga teachers here refer to it as a woman's holiday. Now, essentially, some parts of India, when the woman is on her cycle, she is given complete rest. Now, what does that mean? That means that she's asked not to do any household chores. She is just resting in her room. Okay, she's not cooking, she's not cleaning, everything is brought to her, and she takes a mini vacation of sorts, like a staycation, and does nothing. Now, a part of me always questioned this because I thought it was a little unfair. So I've been having conversations about this with other people. And it turns out this was done for the one main reason that before, I want you to rewind back like 100 years, maybe 150 years. A lot of women did very heavy work, okay, like heavy labor intensive work, not like what you and I do here, at least in America, where we have vacuum cleaners and washing machines and dishwashers and stuff like that. It was physical labor, like you went out into the fields, you traveled far away to work, you actually did really intense physical labor without the help of technology and machines. So it's a little hard for us to relate to, at least for me to relate to be honest. But when someone was on their cycle, they were given days of rest because the body is going through transition and their body is already straining itself. So you were told not to do any additional work. Okay. There were also some other aspects to this, like you don't cook and you don't go to a temple and things like that. I don't want to get into that now because it'll take us a little off track. Okay. That's one part, that women were allowed to rest or were given the opportunity to rest. Now, the second part is there is something called period poverty. Okay. Now, this is something that a lot of people in privileged countries do not ever think about. Period poverty and accessibility to feminine hygiene products. Okay. Now, period poverty is a real thing in many parts of the world where young girls and women do not have access to basic hygiene facilities and products. Okay. Even today, there are millions of women who cannot afford a pad or a tampon. There are millions of women who give up going to school and getting an education because their environment doesn't have restrooms and suitable ways for them to interact when they're on their period. So if you live in a privileged country where you can move around, you have public restrooms, it's safe for you to get from point A to point B on your own, then we're really privileged. Okay. I know for a fact that in India, we have so many parts of rural India where there are no public restrooms that a woman can access. Okay. And it is also parts of India can be, not just India, in many parts of the world actually, it's unsafe for women to travel on their own. And if you look at the poverty that many, many millions of people live with, it's almost unaffordable or is unaffordable to afford any of these products that help a woman during her period. So period poverty is very, very real. Okay. And we should just recognize our privilege. So that putting that into context here, because it'll help you understand a little more when I talk about yoga in India and women doing yoga on their period. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is just always when you view these things, right? You view it with compassion and not necessarily judgment. This is important because there is so much hatred that is thrown towards cultural customs by people who don't understand them or are out of that culture and who hail from different backgrounds and different levels of privilege. So you and I will probably never have to face, or I hope we never have to face, some of these challenges and life hardships. So just a reminder to hold off the judgment and to really respect cultural practices, because at that time they were relevant to somebody and they helped somebody. Okay. And yoga is a cultural heritage to millions. And that goes without saying at this point. You can have your own views, but you can also be respectful of history and cultural practices. Okay. Now, things have really shifted. Okay. I was doing some research before writing out the script for this podcast, and things have really shifted. I believe the first sanitary pad was invented in 1972. Okay, and has evolved since, and it's gotten a lot more convenient and accessible to women all over the world, depending on their privilege and depending on where you live, right? Some of these period products got to you faster, and for some other countries it got to them a lot more slowly. So at least in India, I know for a fact that women now have, at least in certain economic parts of society, have access to all sorts of period products. Okay. And it's easy to walk into a yoga class and continue doing your yoga, or if you go to the gym and working out. Okay. But it took a while to get here, right? We didn't have, a lot of women would be wearing saris and other ethnic wear. It's not necessarily comfortable to go to studios and necessarily work out on your days in that type of gear. So it took a while for India to reach a certain amount of period privilege. Okay. So just keep that in mind. There is a lot more I can go into in history here. If you are interested, I can do a deep dive another time. But I want to shift the conversation now towards yoga. Okay. And I'm going to answer these questions in this episode. Can you do yoga on your period? Should you be doing yoga on your period? What should you avoid in yoga asanas during your cycle? Okay. What to do if you have like a heavy, painful flow. And we'll talk about when you experience PMS, and then we'll get into between your cycles. How do you practice? What about menopause? And what do you do if a student asks you this question about what they should, how do you address this in a class? Do you even bring it up? And so on. Okay, so those are some of the main things I want to touch upon in this very short and quick episode. Okay, so first question, can you do yoga during your period? The short answer is it depends. Okay, it depends on your experience during your cycle, and I'm doing air quotes here for experience during your cycle, because every person's period is different. Some have pain and tremendous difficulty even getting out of bed, and some have it extremely easy, and so it really is dependent on your experience. Okay, so based on that, this question can be answered in many ways. If you are having a painful period, okay, where you can barely move and get out of bed, then you should absolutely rest. You should skip your yoga class during that time, and you should rest and recover. And you should only go back to yoga once you are done with your cycle and your energy is back and you're able to move freely again. If your energy is upbeat, and then you can potentially attend a yoga class, okay? I will talk about what you should modify or skip during those days in a moment. But if you are comfortable moving and doing your household chores and other things and being out, then you could go to a yoga class. Okay. So that brings me to the second question. What should you avoid during your period? Okay. These are things you should avoid during your period, whether it's day 1, day 3, day 5, until your period ceases. This is what you should avoid. Deep back bends. Okay. I'm talking Urdhva Dhanurasana and any progressions from that point on, or Ushtrasana, basic, or Dhanurasana, okay, full wheel, camel, bow pose, things like that. Intense, extreme, full range back bends that really stretch out your abdomen region. Okay, you want to skip that. You want to skip inversions. Now, inversions are poses where you are upside down. Mild to moderate inversions are okay, but completely upright or upside down inversions like Shirshasana, head balance, Sarvangasana, shoulder balance, or things like Pincha Mayurasana, where you're on your forearms and balancing. All of those where you're completely upright should be avoided. Okay. Now, there is some debate in the yoga world about the legitimacy of this, that should you do inversions on your period or not. And science will probably back this and say that if you go upside down doesn't mean your period flow will cease. Okay. But it's not only about biology. That's where we go wrong when we look at some of these things, right? It has never been only about biology. In fact, I would argue that the reason why people say don't do inversions in your period has nothing to do with biology. Okay. It's actually about prana. Okay. It's actually about prana. And I have done a previous episode with Indu Arora, and we've gotten into the different types of prana. And there are many, while you know prana as prana itself, there are many subtypes of prana. Okay. And in the show notes, I will link to that episode that I did with Indu recently. You can listen to it. But there is a certain type of prana called apana prana. Okay. Apana prana. A-P-A-N-A. Apana prana. Now, apana is essentially, it is the prana that expels everything from the body. Okay. That is the prana that you use to eliminate from your body in various ways. So it's the prana that is not meant to be held inside. It's meant to be expelled out of the body. And when we talk about doing inversions, right, during your menses, it is about getting this apana prana out of you. And by going upside down, apana prana has a downward movement. Okay. And if you listen to the prana conversation, we talk about how each type of prana has different directions of movement. So for apana, it is a downward flow. Okay. A downward, outward movement. So by going upside down for long periods of time, we are essentially holding on to our apana in some way. We are preventing it from doing what it's naturally meant to do. And hence, we ask you to avoid inversions when you are on your period. So know that it's not only about biology, okay, and what Western science says about it. We're looking at prana when we ask you not to do inversions. So we've got don't do deep back bends or avoid deep back bends. Avoid inversions, avoid arm balances because it's extreme core work. And generally, we try to stay really soft on the abdomen during those days. You want to also skip anything that is prone, where you're lying on your belly and putting a lot of weight on your belly. For example, Dhanurasana. Okay, bow pose is what comes to mind. You want to avoid deep twisting. You can do gentle twisting, but avoid any deep abdomen churning twisting type of poses like side crow or Parshvabhakasana. And in general, try to avoid a very exerting practice, a very active, overly heating practice, and do something a little more gentle and moderate based on your energy. Okay. So that answers what to avoid during your period. Now, what if you have, say, a painful period or a heavy flow and you can move, but you're just uncomfortable? Okay. In those cases, you opt for really gentle asana, gentle movement. You don't need to do a 60-minute class, just a few little cat cows, of a little bit of a child's pose, little bit of resting hero, a lot of bound angle, especially restorative yoga and Supta Baddha Konasana. Okay. And look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. These are really, I'll give you some images in the show notes as well. These are really useful poses when you have a heavy flow. They'll make you feel a little lighter and will perhaps help with a little bit of the discomfort. Okay. But get lots of rest. That's really important. Okay. If you are someone who experiences a lot of PMS before the cycle, then during that time, do some calming, forward bending poses, okay? Cooling breath work like Brahmari, Shitali, Shitkari, Kaki Pranayama, some gentle yoga, gentle asana, and restorative shavasana. There are so many different forms of restorative shavasana, especially Supta Baddha Konasana. Okay. Stonehenge Shavasana, supported Shavasana. All of these will be really good, but just do something cooling and calming for your nervous system, which down regulates your nervous system and not necessarily something that's very agitating. Okay. And between your cycles, you could do everything. You could do everything from twisting to back bending to upside down to inversions. All of that is, you've got a green light for that. Okay. If you are interested in learning about menopause, then just let me know. I can do another episode on menopause and how to, at least what I have learned about menopause through yoga. I generally avoid talking about this a lot because I'm not in that phase of life. So generally I don't bring it up, but if you want, I'm happy to share what little I know about it. Okay. Just let me know in the comments on Instagram and we can look at this at a later point. Okay. Now, lastly, before I wrap this episode up, so how do you address this in class? Okay. Should you be addressing it in class? I'm not someone who's going to tell you have to do it this way or you have to do it that way. But if you want to bring this up in class, I usually say something like, if you are on your cycle, do this instead. If you are not inverting today, do this instead. And sometimes I have women who just walk up to me before class starts and say, I'm not inverting today, or I'm on my cycle. Is there something I should keep in mind? So I usually don't make it a big deal. I don't make a speech about it. I just slip it into my instructions and offer options. And it's been working. Okay. So I would suggest that if anybody comes to you and asks this, or you want to offer it as something in your practice, just get comfortable communicating it. It will take a little bit of getting used to if you don't already do it, but it's something to keep in mind. Okay. So that's my quick little exploration about yoga and menstruation. I hope this helped. In many ways, this is about keeping both sides of us alive, the masculine side and the feminine side, the energies we have within us, right? The Shiva and Shakti side, and keeping that in balance. And I think this is a necessary conversation in the yoga world when it comes to yoga and menstruation. So I hope this gave you some insight. If you would like me to do a deeper dive into women's health in any way, just let me know. And there is so much more we can get into. As always, thank you for joining me and for all the support for the podcast. You can find everything linked at letstalk.yoga. Remember, the Mindful Yoga Teachers Club is an online mentorship community for yoga teachers. We meet once a month and you can sign up by going to letstalk.yoga and you'll find all the details for my monthly mentorship community. As always, I hope you are well and that your practice is going good. I'll see you next week with a brand new conversation. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.